Good morning again, and sorry for all these technical issues. We are still learning how to use Zoom for these complex events. And the next slide, please. I cannot avoid to start my presentation from a brief overview of the early implementation period of GLASS. I think it started from working on the first global report on global AMR surveillance, which was issued in 2014. And this report, in addition to unsurprisingly high resistance rates reported by most countries, have shown that there are still big gaps in terms of both our knowledge of the global situation on AMR and the country capacities to generate this data. We found in particular that the international standards are lacking, which makes very difficult to compare the data. And also, even if the data are available, they are rarely used to act on this data and introduce measures to contain antimicrobial resistance. The only available metric that was reported was a simple proportion of resistant isolates of specific microorganisms to certain antimicrobials among all other positive cultures, which is great and useful, but still not sufficiently linked to the human health and doesn't reflect the impact on human health. So this report informed the development of the GLASS methodology, which was described in the first GLASS manual, and it was launched in 2015. In 2016, we made the first attempt to engage countries in GLASS, and that's where the enrollment started. And after the sufficient number of countries were enrolled, we made the first data call, and we started collecting the data globally from enrolled countries and published reports. And so far, we have 3 reports on antimicrobial resistance published and 1 global report on antimicrobial consumption. From the very beginning, it was announced that GLASS will be implemented in stages. And this is basically what we call the early implementation stage. It was clear that we'll have to look back at a certain period after 5 years cycle of this early implementation and see where we are and what needs to be done to improve the global surveillance system. So this year is the year of GLASS revision, as already was mentioned. And as already explained, this revision is not an internal process within the GLASS team. We are trying to get contribution and feedback from member states, from technical experts and our implementing partners all over the world. That's why you will have to click Marcello. There is an animation here. Could you please move the slide? So, and that's why we organize this online technical discussion, and eventually we still hope to be able to conduct the face-to-face meeting in Stockholm with participation of member states representative. Next slide, please. GLASS is evolving. It was designed as a system, and from the very beginning it was clear that starting simple from concentrating on surveillance of antimicrobial resistance in a selected number of pathogens and selected number of specimen and antimicrobials, we will need to add new elements because, of course, the problem of AMR is not limited by resistant in selected bacterial infections. During these 5 years, glass evolved quite dramatically. New elements and modules were added to the system, and we are now looking for better terms to describe what we now call glass environment. So within the glass environment, we can distinguish 3 major blocks. One is what we started from, is the traditional surveillance of AMR and AMC, and that's what we call routine data surveillance, because this surveillance is based on data routinely collected. In terms of AMR, this is the data collected from microbiological testing of patients' isolates, and this is the surveillance of antimicrobial resistance, which we call now glass AMR. And I'm happy and proud to tell you that today, the first glass AMC data call starts. It will be launched today with the introduction of 3 new documents providing guidance on surveillance of national antimicrobial consumption and also antimicrobial consumption in hospitals. And this is what we call glass AMC. This is the routine surveillance of antimicrobial consumption. We also found that we can't avoid introducing what we call focus surveillance. And the first element in this group of glass approaches is what we call glass ear. And this is the system designed to receive signals on emerging antimicrobial resistance, both findings of new resistance mechanism and also public health events related to emerging resistance. Another example of focus surveillance, which is its initial phase, but it's developed quite quickly, is the enhanced gonococcal antimicrobial surveillance, which is called glass eGasp. And also what Jorge is going to introduce today in the second part of this webinar is the surveillance of AMR in Candida species in patients with bloodstream infections. And this is part of eventually bigger project. That's why we call it not glass Candida, but glass fungi. In addition to the routine surveillance, it was clear from the beginning, but now we understand it much better. We do need to add to the routine surveillance specific service and studies to fill in the gaps that couldn't be filled by routine surveillance. And there are several already approaches and methods that we offer. They're all in the initial phases. But first is the activities related to One Health AMR surveillance, it's glass One Health. And again, it will be introduced in a specific webinar. There is also a protocol, and already some results coming from this, and this is the point prevalence survey methodology for antimicrobial use in hospitals. And there is already a defined protocol, the glass methodology for estimating the antimicrobial resistant burden. Again, we will have the opportunity today to discuss it in more details. Next slide, please. What I'm going to concentrate now is the new glass AMR manual. The draft document is available on the consultation website, and it's a product of joint work of both WHO staff and many international experts, and first of all, collaborating centers supporting this work. This is the draft that already went through peer review and actually several peer reviews and internal reviews. And still this document is provided on the website, so we could get the feedback on the document and see how we can improve one of the main glass documents. So this document is devoted to updated, revised glass methods for AMR surveillance in humans. And this is part of a bigger package of documents and tools which are developed or are still being developed to inform GLAS 2.0 implementation. This is the informal term we use to define the next stage of the GLAS implementation, the next 5 years. This manual describes the objectives and methodology of GLAS AMR. It provides guidance for countries on the GLAS AMR methods and metrics. And of course, this is a document that we hope would be useful for all the people involved in national AMR surveillance activities beyond just GLAS focal points and other national public health professional authorities responsible for AMR surveillance of humans, and those people who contribute to collection of data. And of course, we hope that it could be useful for professionals supporting surveillance of AMR in other sectors. Next slide, please. So we didn't change dramatically everything. Of course, the next stage will be based on the lessons learned from the first implementation, which proved quite successful. But we are adding new things, and for instance, we are adding new specimens. In addition to what we had in the GLAS version 1, we are adding cerebrospinal fluid, we are adding respiratory samples, and also we are adding rectal and pharyngeal swabs for the surveillance of AMR in gonococci. We are adding also 5 new pathogens, and this is Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Neisseria meningitidis, Haemophilus influenza. So far we collected data on non-typhoid Salmonella, so we are adding Salmonella typhi and Paratyphi. Of course, we are adding some new antimicrobials, both to describe the resistance of newly added target pathogens, and also to include both first and second line antimicrobials according to WHO-aware antibiotic categorization. Next slide, please. In the new manual, we are devoting quite a lot of space on explaining the GLAS approach to assessing and improving the validity and representatives of surveillance data. So this is important because now establishing the standards of surveillance, we still need to make sure that the global surveillance produce reliable and representative data. There are 2 new options also introduced in the GLAS manual. One is an option for submission of anonymized individual patient level data. This will provide additional opportunities for AMR surveillance data validation and analysis comparing to what we have now. This is just national aggregated data. There is another option, and I call it option because not all the countries may be able to generate data using molecular diagnostic methods. But we believe that countries that do generate this data could contribute a lot. So we offer an option for submission of data generated by molecular AMR diagnostics to complement current phenotypic AMR diagnostic data and improve our understanding of the underlying mechanisms of resistance. Next slide, please. There are several objectives of GLAS AMR, and some of these objectives are also linked to the other modules in the GLAS environment. But basically, these are the objectives that are covered by the manual. And one and the first and probably the most important objective of GLAS AMR is not even the collection of global data, but fostering national surveillance system and harmonized global standards. This is the ultimate goal of GLAS, to make sure that countries develop the national surveillance systems serving many possible purposes. Of course, another objective is monitoring global AMR trends in bacteria causing common infection in humans and inform the WHO model list of essential medicines and WHO classification of antibiotics. I should explain probably because people keep asking why do we say fast-growing bacteria, especially that some of the GLAS target pathogens are not exactly fast-growing. This is just to differentiate that the GLASS methodology described in the manual doesn't cover surveillance of TB, which is already well developed and described in specific documents. Another objective, of course, is estimate the extent and burden of AMR globally by selected indicators, and we will have a different presentation today. Of course, we can detect emergent resistance in its international spread. We do aim to generate data to inform the implementation of prevention control strategies, and of course, we are aiming to inform research and development of the new tools for prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of infection caused by resistant bacteria. Next slide, please. The manual also describes the essential core components of the national surveillance of AMR that GLASS promotes. I don't have sufficient time to describe all the components, but basically we believe that the national surveillance system could be effective if it's coordinated and organized from a national coordinating center, supported by national reference laboratory responsible for AMR, and of course it received the data coming from surveillance sites from the healthcare facilities. And we change even this diagram. Before the icons for the healthcare facilities were the same. So we had several experts suggesting that we show that we aim to engage, to enroll different types of facilities with different types of health services, just to ensure that the data coming from these surveillance sites are more representative in terms of describing the national situation. Next slide, please. So what are the GLASS AMR surveillance approach? First of all, when we describe the surveillance approach, we need to define the population under surveillance. And the population under surveillance in GLASS is composed of patients seeking care in healthcare facilities and for whom clinical samples are collected for routine microbiological investigations, which includes both species identification and antimicrobial susceptibility testing. The data are collected through a surveillance system which gathers results from this susceptibility testing for targeted human bacterial pathogens, which are isolated from specimens sent routinely to laboratories for diagnostic purposes. That's why I keep calling it routine surveillance. And together with patients' microbiological results, the countries are also invited to report demographic and epidemiological variables, both in aggregated or individual level format. And that attempt makes it different from some other systems that are concentrating on purely microbiological data. Next slide, please. This is a diagram that is trying to show the different approaches in terms of GLASS options to do surveillance of AMR. So the most traditional one practiced by the majority of surveillance system is what is called isolate-based surveillance. And this is a fraction of patients within the total population that have positive cultures of specific targeted microorganisms. So we're interested to see what are the proportion of patients with AMR infection within this population. But the thing is that is still a small part of the population that we're interested to see the situation with the AMR. And while we're still, with the current approach, not able to cover the total population actually with the testing and AMR, there is, in many cases, there is no such a need or possibility. We still have the population with tested samples that basically represent the population of patients having certain syndromes that suffer from resistance. And this is what we call sample-based AMR surveillance. Next slide, please. So this is another way to show the difference between what we call isolate-based and sample-based surveillance approaches. So for both, we collect the results of antimicrobial susceptibility in patients for bacterial pathogens and antibiotics under surveillance. What we are adding with the sample-based approach is the numbers of patients from whom samples have been collected for microbiological testing, and this includes patients both with and without growth of the bacterial pathogens under surveillance. And this is what makes available a good denominator that is produced by sample-based approach. Next slide, please. It is reflected in the most common metrics which could be produced by these surveillance approaches. So the key metric for isolate-based surveillance is the proportion of drug resistance. For example, we can calculate the number of patients with bloodstream infection caused by E. coli resistant to cefotaxime out of all the patients with bloodstream infections caused by E. coli with AST results. And usually this measured in percents. This is the common and widely accepted metric. Next slide, please. There are some additional metrics that come from the sample-based surveillance metrics. And first of all, we can calculate the frequency of infection caused by a specific pathogen. So we have an understanding what is the impact of certain nosologic forms on patients with a specific syndrome. But also, we can calculate frequencies of drug-resistant infection caused by pathogen. And that's important because with the high proportion of resistant immunospecific pathogen, this pathogen still could be causing just a limited number of infections, which limits the impact on public health. When we calculate the frequency of drug-resistant infection, we can better understand what is the role of specific resistant pathogen in causing certain types of infection in patients seeking care. And also we are much more flexible in terms of stratifying the data and calculated this frequency for specific groups of patients different by demographic or other epidemiologic variables. Next slide, please. This is how it looks like when we calculate the frequencies. And this slide shows, of course, first of all, the difference between the AMR frequencies in community and hospitalized patients, which is not surprising. But also it shows the way of visualizing and reporting data coming from sample-based surveillance. And in these two groups of graphs, community and hospital, on the left, we can see the frequencies of infections caused by specific pathogen. So we can see the role, for instance, of E. coli in bloodstream infection in community patients on the left. But also it shows what are the major resistant strains or isolates or variations that cause this specific infection by this specific pathogen. And there's a frequency of resistant infection caused by specific pathogen. Next slide, please. So, of course, the GLASS approaches are based on certain assumptions. And we assume in particular that patients with a specific syndrome who seek care at the healthcare facility will be assessed by a healthcare professional, and the sample will be taken according to best clinical practices, and this sample will be then sent to laboratory for diagnostic microbiology and susceptibility testing. We also assume that the growth of a pathogen in selected specimens is a proxy for patient infection in the associated anatomical side. So it could be bloodstream infection, urinary tract infection, lower respiratory tract infection, enteric infection. And for this to be true, the submitted data must relate to a true episode of illness in a patient. And this, of course, depended on diagnostic criteria that are applied in specific settings. We also assume that the number of isolates with AST result can be used as a representation of the number of patients infected with the target pathogen in a specific site. And that is possible after removal of repeated isolate, which we call in our jargon deduplication. Of course, that depends on how comprehensive is the application of routine microbiological testing. And ideally, we believe that all patients with suspected infection will have a sample taken according to this best clinical practices. Next slide, please. Of course, we do understand that there are certain considerations should be put when designing the system, running surveillance, and analyzing the data. And of course, when we generate estimates for AMR in the target population, when we use data collected through this routine surveillance, there is a great concern which is related to selection bias. And there are many sources of this selection bias. And GLASS has developed a protocol that describes the way to, if not to avoid, then to address the selection bias. There are many examples. I will provide one of the most obvious. For instance, if the surveillance data are generated mostly in big tertiary hospital, they have the capacities both to sample patient and apply antimicrobial susceptibility testing. Of course, the attempt to estimate the national situation in AMR and the total national population would be biased towards the data coming from the big tertiary hospitals. But the thing is that the bias is not on the data. The bias is in the way the data are interpreted. Why the extrapolation of the data coming from a certain type of hospital could be provide biased estimation of AMR in the total population, it will still provide a good understanding of the AMR situation in this specific group of hospitals, like city hospitals, for instance. So there are ways also to deal with this selection bias. And of course, there are some consideration because we rely on routine diagnostic results, using them for surveillance purposes, and there are some disadvantages, especially in countries with limited resources, linked to the limited access of healthcare and microbiological testing, difficulties in obtaining a representative sample in the population of seeking care. This could be late microbiological testing, only after antimicrobial treatment failures, or when patients are severely ill, the microbiological methods could be inaccurate. The thing is that we do understand this, but the purpose of even discussing this now is that we need to be aware of this, and we need to understand also there are ways to deal with this, to improve the quality of the data. And that's one of the things that GLASS is going to be concentrating in the second stage, finding and implementing the way to improve the quality and representativeness of the AMR surveillance systems. So there are some additional approaches that could be used. Next slide, please. Which we call complementary surveillance approaches. And while they're not yet part of the GLASS environment, we are working now for providing the countries with the guidance and protocols for conducting the studies. Some are already on the way. So when I say complementary surveillance approach, I mean, first of all, what we call syndrome-based AMR surveillance and other experts call also case-based AMR surveillance. And this is an approach which is based on active and systematic case-finding approach to identify patients with signs and symptoms that meet the case definition for specific syndromes. And of course, this approach could more accurately reflect the incidence of resistant infection in the population under surveillance and provide more precise data about the burden of AMR in chosen setting. So, of course, it's quite laborious. It requires additional resources. And that is because we don't offer this to countries as the main option for conducting the surveillance. So we still expect countries to conduct isolate or sample-based surveillance, but where syndrome-based AMR surveillance could be applied, this would greatly benefit the surveillance system and our knowledge about AMR. There are also other approaches like the population-based surveillance using LQAS, and this is quite a specific approach that could be quite useful when we need to study AMR prevalence in infection with the relatively low prevalence. And you can actually refer to the GLASS manual and the referred publication to learn more about the methodology for this population-based surveillance. I'm afraid I'm out of time to do this in many details. Next slide, please. There are some other considerations that we put in the manual. And of course, for instance, there are certain considerations about targeting the population of patients seeking care, understanding that in some countries, it's not all the patients that could really have access to healthcare facilities, even they have symptoms of the syndromes under GLASS surveillance. Some patients, even with the access to healthcare facilities available, may prefer self-treatment with the antibiotics shared by neighbors, and these people are left out of the scope of the surveillance that is targeting the patient seeking care, of course. But then again, knowing this issue, we have also ways to address this. And of course, all our efforts to improve access to healthcare facilities, for instance, will solve this particular problem. There are some other considerations that are elaborated in the manual, but as I said, my time is limited, so I would move on. Next slide, please. There is a section in the GLASS manual which is called bias mitigation to improve data representativeness. And this is exactly what I was telling you about the ways to deal with the biases and imprecision of surveillance data. And of course, we need to improve the system capacity for generating results that represent the true proportion of AMR in a defined population. And while, of course, the ideal approach would be to survey all individuals within the population, it's, of course, costly, time-consuming, basically almost impossible to implement in large populations. But there are methods, statistical methods, that allow us to identify a sample of individuals which might be representative of the whole target population. So we could generate outcomes that reflect the actual occurrence in the larger entity. And also we need to make sure that the system is able to capture all symptomatic patients constituting the defined population for which AMR rates are estimated. And of course, we know that even with a clear case definition, clinicians do not always take samples for culture and AST from all patients for suspected infections. So this difference, of course, might generate bias, but then again, while this may not be possible in the routine approach, the additional study, specific service could solve the problem. Next slide, please. So to the new additions, and this is the full list of priority specimen types now included in the GLASS manual, and now it includes blood, cerebrospinal fluid, urine, stool, lower respiratory tract infection, and also urethral, cervical, rectal, and pharyngeal swabs for surveillance of AMR and gonorrhea. And on the right, you can see the main syndromes that correspond to the priority specimen types. Next slide, please. This is the list of GLASS target pathogens, and the new additions are presented in bold font. So this is Acinetobacter, still not Baumannii, because we still have many countries with the problem of identifying the Acinetobacter 2 species. E. coli, Klebsiella pneumonia, Pseudomonas aeruginosa is a new addition, Staph aureus and Streptococcus pneumonia. We included now Neisseria meningitidis and Haemophilus influenza. Salmonella remains with the addition of typhoid salmonellas, and Shigella and Neisseria gonorrhea are still in the list. And there are many reasons for choosing this GLASS pathogen that are listed on the slides, and of course, this is quite common bacterial infections, and they could be life-threatening, and some also represent foodborne infections, so provide common indicators for surveillance of AMR in food chain. Of course, we considered the public health burden. We also considered the significant morbidity and mortality, if not globally, then in low and middle income countries, hence inclusion of Shigella, for instance. Some pathogens are not quite common, but in some specific vulnerable population that could cause severe infection like Haemophilus influenza. And basically, most of the GLASS target pathogen, they are also included in the WHO global priority list for research and development of new antibiotics. And of course, we keep explaining to countries that the priorities for local and national surveillance may be different and may include other organisms. So this is the list of target pathogens selected for global reporting. Next slide, please. So this is the table showing both the target pathogen and specimen types, because of course we are not collecting data for all pathogen in all specimen types. So this is an overview of the pathogens that are linked to specific specimens. Like for instance, most pathogens isolated from blood are of interest as supposed to be reported to the global system. Next slide, please. We also added new antimicrobials, and there is a table in the manual that shows exactly the specimens, pathogens, and antimicrobial drugs selected for the global surveillance. And we have total 32 antimicrobial drugs selected for the next stage. And according to the WHO AMR classification, 11 belong to the access group, 18 are in the watch group, and 3 are in the reserve group. And 18 of the antibiotics selected for the GLASS reported, they're included in the current WHO AML. Next slide, please. We also made an effort to explain to the readers a very important point that sometimes people not really understand, that the GLASS AMR list of target antimicrobial pathogen combinations is selected for global surveillance purpose only. It is not intended anyhow to guide testing or prescribing practices. So it doesn't mean that all of included antimicrobials should be routinely tested by clinical laboratories. It just, if this testing is done, of course, we expect it to be reported to GLASS. Again, we made an attempt to select a small number of representative drugs for each antimicrobial group. Sometimes there are similar drugs in the same categories, but it's done just because different labs in different countries will test just one drug in a group, and the laboratory may change which drug is tested over time. So we're trying also to add some practical considerations to define these drug-bug combinations in the new table. Next slide, please. So we will keep, of course, the traditional GLASS approach of collecting aggregated data. And this is just the table you already saw, but with a different meaning, because it shows the data sets collected by GLASS when collecting aggregated data. And we have the names, the funny names for the data set. And this is for isolate-based surveillance, is RIS data set. And basically, this is patient AST results for bacterial pathogens, antibiotics under surveillance. But when we do the sample-based surveillance, we add the sample data set with the numbers of patients with both negative and positive results. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the RIS data set, and this is the list of variables included in the RIS data set. Most countries that are already enrolled in GLASS and report data, they are familiar with this list of variables. And basically, this is in addition to, of course, reporting country and year of data collection. This is a specimen type, pathogen. Also, the three important variables that GLASS collects from the very beginning. This is gender, age group, and infection origin, community versus hospital, and the AST results per se. Also, we provide an option of reporting subsets of national aggregated data when there are some different sub-national AMR surveillance systems, or when the data reported from the parts of the country which are so different in many ways that the data couldn't be aggregated together. So countries decide if they provide any subsets, but usually just one set of data coming from a country. Next slide, please. This is a brief overview of the sample data set, and basically the major variable here, which is added, is a number of tested patients, including both negative and positive samples. And of course, it includes also the stratifying variables in case we want to calculate frequency stratified by this gender, age group, or infection origin. Next slide, please. The new option, which is already practiced by several networks, and that includes CSER, that includes EARSnet, that includes some plans that now PAHO is implementing, is submission of anonymized individual level data. And we really expect member states to agree with this approach, because this would let us better manage and validate data. We could monitor the occurrence of multi-drug resistance, which we cannot do with the aggregated data. We can explore additional data analysis and stratifications. We can generate statistics, regional, state, province, not for the global reporting, but for the use by national surveillance systems. We can analyze drivers and risk factors linked to resistance. We can enhance the ability to study of evolution of resistance during the year, improve capacity for outbreak detection, generate transmission trends, provide several additional ways to assess data quality. So there are many arguments towards collection of anonymized individual level data submission. Next slide, please. These are the variables that we propose to include in the individual level data set. You can read it from the screen. It is not really different from what is collected by the existing surveillance networks I already mentioned. And sometimes people ask, why don't we add also to this data set the patient outcomes or previous antimicrobial treatment? And there are so many variables that would be so interesting and excited to include in this individual data set. I would say that even collecting this data from countries, and a majority of which the center of gravity for AMR surveillance is still in the microbiological labs, is challenging. Even that data set is challenging. We do understand that it is important to study patient outcomes. It is important to consider the antimicrobial treatment, but that's exactly why we are saying that we need to add additional studies that would be able to target outcomes and antimicrobial treatment. And one example of such an approach is already realized in the GLASS attributable mortality protocol that Barbara will be presenting later today. Next slide, please. So this individual level submission approach also involves collection of additional denominators. So there is a list of denominators that I don't have time to read, but then it will be in the manual and in the slides. So this is a number of denominators that will greatly improve the epidemiological side of AMR surveillance. So we do hope that this option will be accepted by many countries. Next slide, please. Of course, we will keep collecting the data on the status of national surveillance system. This is another important component of GLASS that will remain in the next stage. Next slide, please. And this is the GLASS AMR data flow, which may look to those who are familiar with the first GLASS manual similar, but it is not. And not just because we added the two options, aggregate data and or anonymized individual level data accepted, but it stresses the role of WHO regional offices, which share a lot of responsibility with the GLASS team. And while the GLASS team is still responsible for developing the global standards together with the regional offices, collaborating centers, international partners, and producing global reports, there is a lot of responsibilities on the regional offices that, because it's they who work with the countries directly, provide technical support, help the countries build their capacities. And of course, there is a need of generating the regional reports on AMR, which are adopted for a specific purpose. So this is the main change in the GLASS AMR data flow. Next slide, please. Of course, we are working on improving the GLASS IT platform. This is just a slide showing the new interface, but there are new models being developed, and basically with the new AMC data call, the new module for collecting national antimicrobial consumption data will be fully functional now and used by countries, in addition to some other new modules like the one for tricycle project, etc. So the platform is being developed, and of course we need reflections and comments from countries to keep improving the platform and building its analytical capacities. So this should be probably one of the main things in the online consultation, the way we improve the data collection and analysis. Next slide, please. We will keep reporting AMR data through various means, through regular reports, but also through the website. Currently, the WHO Global Health Observatory, but WHO is working now on a very ambitious project of creating a global portal, which would actually aggregate all the data collected by WHO. And probably in the near future, we'll be able to introduce this to you. Next slide, please. We will keep reporting also not just the AMR data, but also the data on the summary status of national surveillance system. Next slide, please. And one of the new additions, which was already covered by GLASS, but now it just gained some importance, is that we have a new Sustainable Development Goal AMR indicator. And this is proportion of bloodstream infections among patients due to MRSA and E. coli resistant to third generation cephalosporins. Next slide, please. And GLASS is already collecting this data. Now it's recognized as the G indicator, and this slide just shows that the data already being collected. This is exactly the part of this SDG indicator, the resistance of E. coli to third generation cephalosporins on the right in patients with bloodstream infections. Next slide, please. So my time is running, and I don't think I'm guilty really, because we spent quite some time for the introduction that also was needed. So probably I go faster than acceptable by the audience, but that's what I have to do, because we do want to have some time for discussion. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief overview of the work which is still in progress. And this is about the ways to improve the quality and representatives of the surveillance system, surveillance data. So we have some understanding what might be a successful AMR surveillance system. And we know that ideally it should generate comparable, representative, high quality data of pathogens of concern from the target population. And for that, it should be sensitive. So it should be able to detect true health event, and that's also we call precision. It should be specific, and it should be able to show how infrequently system detects false positive health events. Again, it goes with the precision. It should be timely. So the occurrence of the health events should be reported in timely fashion to health agencies. It should be also representative, so it should accurately observe both the occurrence of the health event over time and also distribution by person and place of this event in the population at any point in time. So systems that collect the data through routine diagnostic, of course, they lack to some extent the precision because of the limited number of AST performed or results reported. And due to the sample bias, I mentioned that they may lack representativeness. But as I said, that something could be done about this. Next slide. And we are working now on the GLASS method, which could help. And it's based on certain what we call benchmarks and sampling criteria for AMR criteria to enhance estimates in terms of its precision. And that's where we are trying to estimate the sample size based on our understanding of the prevalence of certain specific resistant infection in the population, and also to improve representativeness. And for that, we offer sampling strategy. And this is built upon the Garant GLASS approach. It just complements the continuous AMR surveillance system, which are based on routine AST testing. The target population remains the population of patients who seek care in healthcare facility, who are cultured and tested for identification and AST. And this is for countries that they can reach at least 70, and this is the arbitrary number. It's still being discussed in testing coverage of the national population of patients seeking care. Next slide, please. The thing is that we are trying to define a minimum number of patient results that must be obtained by the end of the survey, which is added to the routine surveillance exactly to estimate the numbers of patients that we need to survey. And this, of course, depends on the expected prevalence, and that's another effort to do, of defined infection asset and nested AMR infection in the target population. This approach is particularly important for the syndromes in which patients are not always samples, or samples are not always sent for bloodstream for bacterial identification and AST, like UTI, for instance. But also we introduce sampling criteria because we are interested in the patient results from different geographical or administrative areas. We are interested in results coming from patients in healthcare facilities providing different types of care. So the sampling strategy is a stratified sampling, which is proportional to size cluster sampling in statistical terms. Next slide, please. This is just an example of how it may look like. But here I need to explain that these are not any criteria for inclusion of surveillance data in the global database. No, this is just a tool, quite laborious tool, I would say, that is offered to countries that want to improve the quality of their surveillance systems. These are not the criteria for accepting or rejecting the data coming from a country. This is a tool to improve national AMR surveillance systems. Next slide, please. So there is a protocol also, which is important because, as I already mentioned, all these sampling strategies and benchmarking is not really useful when the coverage by testing is low. So we do need to understand what are the testing coverage before we made any calculations, any attempts to calculate the sample size, etc. So we do need to have ways to estimate the testing coverage. And we did this so far for bloodstream infections. I guess similar approaches could be developed for other types of infection. Next slide, please. But this is the tool for estimating the surveillance coverage. Please keep clicking. So basically, the way to ensure that all these difficulties in obtaining the representative sample of population of seeking care could be addressed and fully understood. So next slide, please. The bloodstream infections were chosen because they're among the most significant causes. And we know that even for bloodstream infections, patients are not always tested, and there is a way to administer empiric antimicrobial therapy without taking a culture. Some tests, for some settings, tests might be unaffordable, and that's why the selection bias occurs. So to avoid this biased estimates, I already mentioned before, next slide, please. We do address the whole diagnostic pyramid, seeing how many patients with AST results available, how many patients with blood isolates for selected pathogens are in the database. But basically, we need to compare this coverage with the needs. So for that reason, we need also to be aware of the number of patients with blood samples taken, but also with patients with clinical symptoms of bloodstream infections. And of course, we need to see if this subpopulation reflects the whole situation in the patient seeking healthcare facilities and other health services. So this is the diagnostic pyramid explaining the essence of the methods. I guess, next slide, please. I can stop here. I would just say that there are two ways of do this estimate of diagnostic coverage. And one is based on passive case detection, studying medical records. In many settings, it may be difficult or also impossible. So for that reason, we also offer active case-based sampling, which could be prospective. It involves comparison with passive surveillance data involves organizing specific studies with the before-after design, cluster randomized trials. So this is what is explained in details in the document that is now work in progress, but will be shared soon. So I really had to hurry up with this. So probably it's not exactly a good comprehensive definition of the new methods which are under development, but the main message is that we do understand the limitations of the routine surveillance, and we do offer the ways out of this problem. Thank you for your attention. I will stop here because we reach the time for the break, and we still hope to have some questions asked now, but also I'm sure that the online platform will offer more opportunities for asking questions, providing your comments. Again, I also hope that in the end of the webinar today, we may have some time for a general discussion. Thank you for your attention again.